Sometimes, if you're like me, a person of color, it can be a little bit overwhelming to try and integrate all the information that you're told about nutrition. It gets to a point where it can be very confusing because obviously sometimes when you look at yourself through the eyes or through the lens of the plate that is presented before you, it may not necessarily be something that you can easily relate to. Is the reason why today I will be sharing something that could be an easy starting point, especially for us, the people of color, when you're trying to understand simple nutrition and what you can do to be able to eat very healthy. So I'm in a browser here. Obviously, it's a private browser because I do not want all the other things on my screen to be seen. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to type African if I can say, type Caribbean, it will guide. I'll reject this. It brings me onto this here. Obviously, there is African It-Well LNK. There is all the different things, but what I'm interested in is the African It-Well guide. That is the NHS. So I'm going to click on the NHS, which brings me to this window here. So I'll spend a few minutes just trying to explain what this plate is all about. Obviously, the guide in the UK looks like a plate. The guide in other countries, there are some that look like a pyramid. There are some that look like a heart. There are some that look very different. So every single nation will have different way in which they represent or want their traditional people to eat or their people to eat in their countries. So in the UK, it's a plate. The plate here represents, obviously, when you're having your meal, what you should be including. The biggest proportion here you will see is basically fruits and vegetables. And what I want you to look out is some of those things that if you step out to go to the market today, you should be able to find them. Things like peas, things like tamarind, things like guava, soursop, garlic, things like pak choy, things like coconut, bananas. These are things that you will easily, pineapples, find them hopefully in the local market where you go doing your day-to-day shopping, watermelon, grapes, etc. This is something that should really be a biggest component of your in a food. So for example, if you're packing up lunch or you're packing up dinner, having at least a good proportion of your plate filling up with these. When it comes particularly to things like fruits, I may be a little bit more cautious about them because obviously some of them can have a high sugar content. That's why I'm not a very great fan of juicing, because once you juice, number one, you're reducing the fiber because you're eliminating the fiber from the fruit, but also number two, you can intensify some of these sugars. But anyway, that's a topic for another day. So if you're thinking of things like bananas, thinking of things like that can have a high sugar content, you may want to really limit that or put that to a really minimal. And then of course there are things like watermelon, which over 80% of a watermelon, 90% I think, is all water. So those could be good things. And of course you're trying to think of, for example, a cucumber. You have a cucumber which is almost 100% of water. If you've got one cucumber, you'll have less calories in there compared if you had something like one banana. So trying to think again, if you're going to carry out what's called healthy swaps, what could you potentially be able to look out and be able to in this case make sense of which will be traditional for you and for your where you're currently living. And then, of course, there is the second portion here, which is basically your starchy foods, which include things like your bread, your pasta, etc. So agege bread for some of us who are from West Africa. They can be like plantain, green bananas from Uganda, from Kenya, whole grain, flours, porridge, etc. This is a place where I will encourage, for example, sweet potatoes are full of things like beta carotene, which is good for you. They are low glycemic index, which means they will not spike you blood glucose, and they're good for blood glucose regulation. But this is where caution might be applied, because obviously sometimes when we're eating our food, our fufu, our ugali, we literally fill up a plate with ugali and then we have a little bit of vegetables. The reverse should be true. You should be filling up with more vegetables and a bit of ugali, because those energy dense foods become a little bit more difficult. Of course, it takes time for them to digest, but also the energy dense foods are full of calories. And of course, if you're eating too much, we know by now, I'll talk a little bit about it later on, the energy balance, you can easily gain weight on those foods. Then, of course, there is this part here, this portion where you have the such unsaturated oil. So thinking about things like sunflower oil, it could be things like canola oil. And this is somewhere that there can be a bit of controversy. People say there could be things like peanut oil. They say oils, some of the oils can be inflammatory and things like that. This is something I'll leave it for another time, a topic of discussion later on. But think about if you have things like palm oil, coconut oil, those oils that can easily be accessible. But if you're having things like oils, coconut oil, palm oil, they all are saturated as well. They have saturated fat. You may want to think of, for example, in particular palm oil, reducing the quantity of what you have rather than exceeding it. And then, of course, that can become problematic in sense. There is also here a place or a portion for dairy. It says here semi-skimmed milk. For me, I think it depends. If you have, for example, a family with younger children, you may want to do full fat milk, which in the end will be really useful. And of course, using less, or you go for those varieties where the cream and the fat have been removed. Soya drink, I personally drink soya because I try to stay dairy free, but things like cheese as well, those are dairy and alternatives. Choose those lower fat and lower sugar options. Obviously, I've talked about when they're making things like yogurt, if they reduce the fat, they may include other things to give you the creaminess, the texture, the mouthfeel. So you may want to think of, when you're thinking of buying Dutch yogurt, what exactly are you buying? And of course, here is a portion where you have all your proteins. So you can have, for example, the plant-based proteins where you have the beans, your lentils, your legumes in particular, lupins, etc. You can also have things like soy chunk. You can have meats. You can have things like crustaceans. You can have your eggs. You may have as well some of your fishes. You can have tilapia, mackerel, chicken, all those different types of proteins. The thing to think about again is when it comes to protein is be wary, because some of these protein rich foods can actually be allergens. So for example, crustaceans or seafoods can have allergenicity effects on them. Things like eggs as well. Things like dairy can be allergenic. So the difference between an allergen and food intolerance just means that if you eat that food, your body does not have the enzyme, or the enzyme is ineffective to break it down. For example, lactose needs to be broken down into the glucose and the galactose that is used to make the lactose, if I remember well from my chemistry. But then if you're not breaking that down effectively, that can result in things like flatulence, but it's not going to kill you. Whereas when it comes to an allergy, that's where your body senses the protein that you're eating as an enemy. What it does is that it actually enacts or activates itself to fight. So it will release its defense mechanism to fight against the enemy that is saying, and in this case is the protein, and that can result in things like anaphylactic shock, which can result in swelling of the airwaves, hives, and all these reactions. And so an allergic reaction can kill you. So it's a life-threatening condition. That's something that, again, you need to be careful if you've ever been diagnosed with allergies, to watch out for some of these allergenic foods. And then, of course, there are things that are outside of the Eat Well guide. So things like our meat pies, our mandazis, our mahamri for the Kenyan East African people, our cookies, things like ketchup, our dressings, things like fried doughs, the puff dumplings, etc., malt drinks. Those are things that you need to eat often and in small amounts. Moderation is key. I'm not saying do not eat at all, because some of these we eat them as a comfort food. I eat my mandazis, but I eat them as a comfort food. I don't cook them every single day. It's something that I do it once in a while, and when I do it, is for enjoyment. Once we finish that, it's done. I don't crave it again another moment. The thing also to think about about outside this here, this guide is the water. You need to consume at least 6 to 8 glasses of water per day. I say myself I do about 4 liters because obviously I tend to suffer from heat edema during the summer months, but of course that's something to think about. You may also include teas, coffees that are sugar free. You may have lower fat milk, but if you're going down the route of juicing or having juices, limit it to a maximum of 150 mils per day, because obviously the sugar in it can actually have impact and effect on your teeth, dental caries, etc. You also are thinking about things like extra calories. If you really want to have your sugar-free, for example, tea, and you find it really difficult, you may want to think about sweeteners. There are those natural sweeteners and there are those artificial sweeteners. So there are natural sweeteners, things like honey, date, agave, maple syrup. Those are things that you could think of and you could add them in your meals and in your drinks, for example, if you want sweetness. But of course, you can also go for some of things like stevia, aspartame. Those will be a little bit more processed sweeteners. Also, outside of this guide, here you can see this traffic light system. In the UK, they use the traffic light system, which is basically the labeling. So when you go to buy something, it's always important to check the label. Different countries use different things. So if in your country, just check what is on that label. I always say if it is green means go, like you're driving. If it is amber, maybe, but when it is red, it means really take care. Look, especially things like sugars, especially things like saturated fats, because saturated fats are those that can actually have the propensity or the capability of having an issue, especially to do things like cholesterol accumulation. If you have issues with cholesterol, I always say, if you know what to do with cholesterol, the body doesn't really bother much with it, because obviously there are two different types of lipoproteins. There's the low density lipoproteins and the high density lipoproteins. You want to have more high density and reduce the low density ones in your blood and things like that. So sometimes when you have saturated fats and your body doesn't know what to do with it, it can elevate those low density lipoproteins, and that can become a problem, and that's something you really want to limit. Obviously, one important thing to think about is how many calories can you consume per day. In the UK, it's advised for a man to consume at least 2,500 calories. That's if you want to maintain weight. I mentioned this, I usually say energy balance is the game here. Energy in, same as energy out. You're going to maintain weight. So that's going to be 2,500 calories for a man, 2,000 calories for a woman. That's like an adult woman who's trying to maintain weight. If you want to lose weight, your energy in must be less than the energy out, and that means maybe you're eating less calories or you are exercising more, so you are ending up into a negative energy balance or calorie deficit, and that will make your body to scavenge around and try to break down any stored energies and reserves, and that will result in you starting to lose weight. If you want to gain weight, so that will be, you need to be negative energy balance to lose weight. You will be in positive energy balance. It just means that the energy that you are consuming is way less than what you are using. So at the end of the day, you are having, for example, sorry, it's less, what you're consuming is more, whereas you're using less. So it means that your body will end up storing and holding on to those reserves, and it results in weight gain. So if you really want just to simplify this for you, or to make it more simple, just think about, I have a plate, and in this plate, I want to think of what should I include more. So as I said, if you want to eat ugali, vegetables, we call them mboga in Kenya, and maybe meat. Think about if it's red meat, not more than 70 grams per day. So just like a feast, shouldn't be more than 70 grams. If it's something like fish, you may want to eat at least 2 portions of oily fish. That includes things like salmon, which will be really helpful for your heart, obviously, because of the monounsaturated fatty acids in there. And then think about, if I'm going to have that, maybe I'll have more fish a bit more vegetables and less of the ugali. Also, if you're trying to lose weight, it may be worthwhile increasing your protein content. You may end up putting more pressure on your kidneys, of course, but proteins rarely are stored. Whereas when it comes to sugars, that's carbohydrates, they are converted into glucose through the glycolysis cycle. And at the end of the day, they produce all the ATPs, that's the energy. And of course, that can be stored. And so that's why they say that generally, if you've got starchy foods, they can give you the propensity of the ability to be able to gain weight. And so next time you're making a decision, of course, there's something that I've not talked about and I've not touched a lot or at all on here, and it's not even part of the Eat Well guide, is alcohol, for example. Alcohol, I tend to say, is empty calories, because obviously at the end of the day, you don't want to be drinking your calories, you want to eat your calories. And so there are 1 or 2 units maybe at most. And if you're thinking of drinking, it may be wine might be better, because it's got things like resveratrol, antioxidants that are good for your heart, rather than drinking things like beer, which again has high sugar content in it, etc. Coming back onto just those vegetables, think of they are full of antioxidants, they are full of minerals in there that will help, for example, vitamin C with immune defense, things like vitamin C, vitamin A. Some of them are antioxidants that will help your body to fight against any of these oxidative stress, and that will help you protect yourself against things like cancers, etc. That are full of phytochemicals, phytonutrients, pigments that are available only in plants, which can be really useful for you. They are full of fiber, so your fiber is good for your gut, bulking, good for your bowel movement, but also some of the insoluble fiber or resistant starch can make its way into the gut, where it's broken down into those, for example, fatty acids, short chain fatty acids, which again can help with harvesting of energy, but also that will be food for your good gut bacteria. And a diverse gut microbiota is the best thing that can ever happen, because there's so much correlation between the gut and your health, gut and immunity, gut and the skin, gut and the brain, gut and the mood, and so many different things. And so it is important for you to look after your gut. So I'm going to stop sharing, because the function or the role of me sharing has come to an end. But I just wanted to encourage you, my brothers and sisters, if you're struggling and wondering, where should I start? That could be something to do. And of course, let me remind you that I don't take copyright of any of the material that I've shared. It belongs to the authors, that's the NHS, etc. But also, this is just like a guide. So I don't expect any of this material or information to be used as medical advice. If you have any medical conditions or in doubt, consult a dietitian, a registered nutritionist, or a healthcare professional who especially understands your history and journey, and they will be able to advise you effectively of what you need to do. I would like to finish by just thanking all of you support what we do by liking, sharing, commenting, subscribing. That will be really helpful. If you haven't done so, why not just click on those buttons? It will help us to continue doing what we do, continue sharing what we share.